To invite, please welcome Valerie Huber as she comes.
Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here, and I just want to say thank you to the New York Medical College, if I got the name right, and to Project Reach for this wonderful conference today. I'm really honored to be here. I am a little nervous about the time frame, though, being right after that delicious lunch, and right about now, the blood is starting to move away from the brain. But hopefully we'll share a few things that are of interest and might make you think a little differently or a little more about a particular topic. So very often when we talk about sex education, it's not a dispassionate discussion of what is in the best health interest of young people. Too often, and I will say, unfortunately, even more so where our office is in Washington, D.C., this becomes a debate who can come up with the best sound bites and a political or ideological victory rather than remembering why we're doing what we're doing. And so this afternoon, I'd like to take just a few minutes to look at the sexual risk avoidance approach in three different ways. First of all, the research behind it, the resonance of it, and the relevance of it. This is not going to be an exhaustive study because I only have 20 minutes and I am going to try very hard to stay within those 20 minutes. But that doesn't mean that there isn't exhaustive research in each of those areas, because there are. A disclaimer is that some of the information we're sharing today is a part of a credentialing program that NAEA provides to the field for sexual risk avoidance specialists. And some of that content has been condensed for today. Some of this is new. So let's look at the research first of all. If you look at the literature, it's really pretty compelling that the sexual risk avoidance approach is empirically valid and it's research-based. Some of the things have already been presented today. Dr. Foley, for example, did an excellent job of kind of laying out the public health framework for this approach and how SRA fits very neatly within that paradigm, and in fact, more naturally so than a sexual risk reduction approach. So I'm not going to spend any time there other than to say we are on solid footing with this approach from a public health standpoint. But SRA also has a solid theoretical framework, and because others are also going to be sharing and have to this point already shared about that theoretical framework, I'm not going to say anything other than to share a few of the theories that really point to the value and even the overriding importance that youth need to receive a sexual risk avoidance approach. And I want to say just one thing about one of the theories without going into it, that's the social norming theory. If you're familiar with that theory, just in a nutshell, it states that among a social group, typically they will overestimate negative behavior of their peers, and then if they believe that a majority of their peers are engaged in a certain risky behavior, then they are more likely to do so as well. If you recognize, and that is a very simplistic view of the theory, but the reason that I bring that up is most adults, and certainly most youth, are not familiar with the fact that most teens have not had sex and are not currently having sex. With the social norming theory in mind, isn't it important for them to know that not only are the majority of their peers not sexually active, but that trend has actually been moving in the right direction over the past 20 years? that's just one example of why the theoretical framework is really critical to what we do. There have been books written on the social science research showing the validity and the importance of the sexual risk avoidance approach. And we don't have the time to go into it right now because we could spend the entire day just looking at this exhaustive list of research. But I wanted to commend to you one particular study that really analyzed all the social science research out there, and would encourage you to take a look at it if you have not read this study. And it was published in 2014 by the University of Navarra. And they broke down the social science research into several categories. The first is, what are the physical consequences of sexual activity, and what are the protective factors if a young person chooses not to be sexually active? And here's what they said. Early sexual activity increases the risk of sexually transmitted infections or unplanned pregnancies, mainly because it's associated with other unhealthy behaviors, such as having multiple partners, concurrent or lifetime, or condom misuse. Again, this is just a summary of the research. But they said, you know, while we often look at this solely from a physical standpoint, someone brought up during one of the Q&A sessions that really it's more than just the physical, right? Well, the research says that's true. And this particular report said this regarding emotional consequences. Adolescent sexual activity is also associated with adverse psychological consequences such as feelings of disappointment and regret, and higher incidence of depression and suicide attempts. And then they cite the various studies that corroborate that statement. But then they go on to say something even more. That we can't look at this from a very simplistic, minimalistic view. We really need to look at this issue holistically. And they say, in addition, the early onset of sexual activity has been linked with substance use and lower academic achievement. And that was cited earlier today as well. And so after they summarized all of the social science research, they said this, which is disheartening. All of these evidence-based facts are routinely ignored when we're talking about the issue of teen sexual activity. And so just going back to my very first statement that I made, that too often this discussion ceases to be a discussion and becomes a debate. What happens when we ignore the research? Then we ignore those who we really want to help. So we would argue that the research is pretty clear that sexual risk avoidance should be a priority for our young people. Let's look at the applied research. The headlines say sexual risk avoidance education doesn't work. Well, how do you respond to that? Well, let's look at the research. You can make that claim if you play selective science, but those of us who really care about helping young people thrive don't want to be accused of playing selective research. So we have summarized the research for the SRA field, and there are 26 studies, none of them which NAEA produced, all peer-reviewed, all showing positive behavioral impact. Those 26 studies, just in summary, show this. 19 of them indicate that students who are a part of an SRA program are more likely to delay sex than their peers. That's kind of a no-brainer, right? If an SRA program was successful, you would certainly hope that that would be one of the tests for success, but it doesn't end there. 3 national studies showed that among students who were a part of an SRA program, if they became sexually active, they were no less likely to use a condom than their peers. That despite the fact that there are no condom demonstrations or distribution in SRA programs. However, contraception is usually discussed in terms of it being a risk reduction strategy, but far inferior to risk avoidance. And there were other positive benefits. One study showed that the students who were a part of an SRA program also correlated to higher increased test scores. 6 of them showed that among those students who were already sexually active, they were much more likely to either discontinue their sexual activity or reduce their number of partners, a move in the right direction, and a great encouragement for those who serve students who are either at risk for becoming sexually active or already sexually active. This is a message that resonates with every student if it is provided in a way that follows best practices and you really connect with that young person. 3 showed a drop in teen pregnancy, and 1 showed that the students who were a part of an SRA program also were less likely to engage in a variety of other risk behaviors. Pretty compelling research. But is this a message that resonates? I mean, broadly? Well, let's take a look at that. We would argue that the SRA message really strikes a chord, not just with youth, but with parents as well. So NAEA commissioned an independent survey of Americans. This was about 1.5 years ago. And we really wanted to dig a little deeper to find out if parents supported the SRA approach or not. Because you read these headlines that show that survey shows parents don't support abstinence education. Well, when you read surveys, oftentimes there are leading questions that if I were given the survey, I would probably have answered with what the majority of parents answered as well, simply because of the wording of the questions. We wanted to put all of that aside and have a very objective survey that laid out how the SRA approach handles certain themes and topics, and how an SRR, sexual risk reduction approach, handles those topics, and what's the difference. Well, here's what we found out. There's a myth that this is a partisan issue. Now, I will say that that myth has fact on Capitol Hill. But if you move outside of the Beltway and you talk to parents, if you talk to adults who work with young people, you find that this really is not a partisan issue. And this survey found the very same thing, that the majority of Americans support the SRA approach. You'll also read in a headline that most parents want contraceptives to be distributed across, the schools, and that needs to be that contraception needs to be shared as a safe alternative if a student is not sexually abstinent. We ask parents and Americans, even who weren't parents, how do you want the topic of contraception discussed? And here is what they said, and you'll find that there's very little difference among all of the different cohorts that we asked. Nearly 9 in 10 parents strongly support their children knowing the limitations of condoms for preventing pregnancy and disease. This despite the fact that some curricula actually warn teachers not to share any of the limitations of condoms. Not only is that oppositional to what most parents want, it's also medically inaccurate to young people not to share all the information.